So welcome to this video on really something that kept changing as I started to do this little project. So originally my goal was just to be able to create some PowerShell that would run whatever command I passed on all the computers in a certain group. And it made sense to use Active Directory groups for that. And so what you're seeing in front of you is just a very, very basic PowerShell that takes the name of an Active Directory group, which contains computer accounts, and then the command I want to run. Now I've hard coded this into variables because what I'm actually going to do with this is make this accessible via Orchestrator, which is then callable by Service Manager. And it's going to tie into email like Office 365 to get notifications and approval. So initially this is just hard coded. You could change this. You could pass these as parameters. For example, parameters, very easy to do. You just say the parameter, is it a string, what the parameter should be, and kind of like a default value. But I'm hard coding it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to enumerate all the computer accounts in the group that I pass. And that's what I do here. This $AD group members uses the get AD group member commandlet and then the name of the group that's passed. So for example, I could just run this. So if I copy this little bit of code and paste it in and put in my file services group, you'll see I have two computers in that group. And then what it does is for each computer in that passed array of groups, I'm going to use invoke command and then pass the name. I'm going to pass the name of the computer. So it's going through each individual returned object from all of the AD group members and then gets the name of this specific computer. Then it's going to run a block of script. Now what I need to do is I want to pass it this custom command. But I can't just send the variable because when I do this invoke command, it creates a new PowerShell session on the remote machine. So none of the variables I actually have available locally would be available on that remote session. It wouldn't work. So instead what I'm doing, I'm creating the script block content. This is what I'm going to send. And essentially I'm passing it a parameter. And the parameter is a variable called $command to run. Then it's going to use invoke expression, which then runs whatever is in this string. So it's going to invoke what is that command to run. So then I use invoke command, the remote computer name. I pass this script block content, which is expecting one argument, this command to run. And my argument list is the original command to run that I've configured here. So that's it. So what it should do is make a directory called John Test on each of the machines in this group. And if I look at those machines, this is the FSO1 and the iSCSI one, those two boxes. And I can very simply run this script. And there it created one of them, and there it created the other. So I can see it created those two folders. And sure enough, there they are. So that worked. So that's fine. And you need to be careful with this. So obviously, if I pass this to delete star.star or do something hideous, it's going to do a lot of damage very, very quickly. But it's very easy using this PowerShell. And I make this available in the link to this video if you go and look in the comments on creating this. So okay, so I have this block of PowerShell that will run whatever command to run is on all the members of the Active Directory group I pass. So now I want to make it available via Orchestrator. But my end goal is to actually make it available via Service Manager. So what my next step is I create a Runbook. So I created this run activity. I'm just going to walk through what I did. So in my start Runbook, I want to be passed the service request ID and the Runbook ID. I'm being lazy. I could work out what the service request ID is from the Runbook ID, but I'm just going to pass it. It saves me having to do a Service Manager lookup relationship. And then I'm going to be passed the name of the Active Directory group and the command I want to run. So I'm taking 4 parameters for this Runbook. The next thing I'm going to do is I actually want to find the actual service request related to this ID. So I'm doing basically a get object. So I find that if I go to my Service Manager, let me just drag that out so you can see it better. Oh, I didn't want to drag it to the bottom. I want to drag it out over here. There we go. So if I look at my service manager, kind of weird what it's done there. There we go. I can see I can do a get object, which is what I'm doing here. This is a get object that I then renamed to get service request. So I select my connection to service manager, which I have defined in my options for service manager. And I type in the name of my service manager management server and my credential. And what I'm doing here is I'm saying, look, my class is of service request. So that will list, when I click those 3 dots, it will show me all the different classes that are available to me. So I selected service request. And it went and found all those out. And there is service request. And then I selected add. And then I added what is the criteria. So I want the ID of the service request to equal that service request ID I passed to my start runbook. And again, I found that by doing subscribe publish data, my start runbook, and I selected service request ID. So now I have here the object of the service request. And I do exactly the same thing to get the runbook automation ID, but this time I look at the runbook ID that I passed to it. So that's easy enough. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run that PowerShell. So I added a .NET activity. So I look at my system. I have run.NET script. So I drag that on. I set the language to PowerShell. And I basically pasted in that PowerShell from before. Now I started off with this. C Windows Sysnative Windows PowerShell V1 PowerShell. That calls the 64-bit version of PowerShell. Natively Orchestrator would run the 32-bit version. I don't want that. Just in case I have 64-bit commandlets I want to use. And then notice instead of that static, I'm using subscribe again. And I can right click and do expand. So it makes it easier to see. So my AD group name is now, I do exactly the same thing. I right click, subscribe to publish data. I want to get my start runbook. And I wanted to get my, in this case, group name. Target server AD group. So I selected that and clicked OK. So that's that target server AD group from start runbook. The command to run is the command to run from start runbook. Then everything else is the same. I have that script block content. I find the groups. And then for each of them, I do that invoke command and I pass the script block. So it's going to run whatever I pass to this runbook on all the machines in that group. Now you may say, why am I doing this in PowerShell? Certainly Orchestrator has its own capabilities to look things up and run commands. If you look at Orchestrator SMA, Service Management Automation, it's all PowerShell workflow driven. And at this point, if I'm creating new runbooks, because that's what I have today, I'm not using Windows Azure Pack yet. I kind of want to do as much as I can in PowerShell. And for this thing, it's just more flexible for me. But certainly if I wanted to, I don't have to use PowerShell here. There are other ways of doing it. But I really think today, if I'm looking at creating new runbooks and I kind of want to future-proof myself, personally, I'm going to err more towards PowerShell. And I'm going to use the things that are kind of unique and very powerful to Orchestrator. So I use the PowerShell that I already created to run that on those remote machines. Great. And then what I'm going to do is, as long as it's successful, I then do an update activity. So if I go back to my service manager, there we go. There is an update object. There we go. So I drag that on. And what I do here is my connection to Service Manager is a service request. The GUID is the System Center Object GUID I got from the Get Service Request. So again, you right click, subscribe to publish data. I select from the Get Service Request. And my selection is SC Object GUID. And then OK. And my description, so what I want to do is I'm selecting the option of fields I want to modify. And what I'm doing here, if I expand this, I'm setting the description. I'm adding in some information. I'm telling it, hey, look, running command, the command I was passed on the servers, completed at this time, a line of stars, and then I put in the description that was already there from the get service request. So basically I'm adding this to the existing content of the description. So basically adding stuff to the description to say what I did. Then I do another update. I could have done it in the same one, but this time I'm setting the status to completed, saying this service request is completed. Now that is assuming it was successful. If the result from the run command failed, i.e. it's warning or failed, then I update it with the description saying the command failed. And then I update the runbook activity to the status of failed as well. So a fairly simple little runbook. So this will now call that PowerShell with the group and the command I run, and we'll update that service request. Now I want to make it available to users. So at this point I check it in, it's available. I would jump over to Service Manager. And now in Service Manager, now I'm not going to go through all of the setup connection to Orchestrator. I have that in other videos. But the key point is I have a connector, and I have a connector to Orchestrator configured. And again, I've gone through this in detail in other videos on my channel, so go and look those up. I've created a new runbook, so I want to make sure I can see that new runbook. So what I would need to do is, once I kind of go in, it's been a little slow to update today. So I would do synchronize now. That would force an update to find all the new runbooks available. Once that's done, I will go in, I will look at runbooks, and my runbook would appear. Now my naming is a little bit poor in this case, but I called it run activity. So sure enough, there is my run activity runbook that I created over here. So I would right click and I would say create runbook automation activity template. Now I've already done that. So you would run that. So I will find the one I already created over here. So there it is. So that's that. If I double click on it, we see this is a runbook automation activity. I gave it a little description. And then all you really have to do in here is configure some basic info. I gave it an area. I set my stage to release. I have to check this is ready for automation. And then I can just see the runbook. Now, there's things to do in here. So for the service record ID, you can go in and add things. Now, these are the 4 fields it's expecting, but I'm not actually going to go and configure these yet. We're going to do that in the next stage. But you see I have the runbook ID. It knows the parameters it's expecting, but I'm not going to change it in here. And that's it. That's really all you have to do when you create that runbook activity. All I need to make sure is I check that is ready for automation. I give it a description, an area, set the release, and I'm good to go. Now what I want to do is actually create a request activity that's actually going to use this. I'm going to create a service request template. So then what I would actually do is I would say, hey, yep, I'm in my template. I'm going to create a template. I give it just my class would be service request. Now I've done it already. So again, you can see my run activity service request. So that's exactly the same thing. Click OK. And now this is the actual request. This is what's going to go and happen. Now in my case, what I actually want to do is not just run this straight away. I want their manager to approve it. So I filled in a title, a description, an urgency, a priority. You can set whatever you want in here. And then under activities, I did 2 things. The first thing I added was a review activity. So I did the default review activity first. So let's look at what I did there. And all I said was, I want manager approval. So I said it has to be approved unanimous by their line manager. So in Active Directory, each user has an organization and you can set who their manager is. So in my example, what I'm saying is whoever their manager is in Active Directory, they have to approve this request before it goes any further. So for example, it's my AD domain control. If I look at my account and look at organization, where's it gone? There we go. I set just the administrator as my manager. So it's going to go and look this up. And because I have a connection to AD as well in Service Manager, it knows that is my manager. And then what I added was my activity, my Runbook automation activity. And I actually selected my run activity. So this is the one that calls the run activity Runbook, which is what this one is right here. So this is now going to go and call that Runbook. And there, sure enough, you can see it. And it's calling my Runbook. This time, so now I'm using it within this service request. If I look at my edit mapping, this is now where I need to start mapping the service request. So I want to go and select service request for my service request ID. Service request. Make sure you select work item and ID. Do not do object ID. I want work item ID under service request for the service request ID. This is what it should look like. Service request, work item ID. For my Runbook ID, edit mapping, I'm going to go ahead and select the Runbook activity this time. So this is Runbook automation activity. Again, work item ID, not object ID. That'll give you the GUID, which is useless to me here. I want the work item ID. So it's Runbook automation activity, work item ID for my Runbook ID. And I'm not worrying about the command to run or target server AD group yet. But I have to make sure I do that mapping. I have to map my service request ID and my Runbook ID. So now I have a service request template that's going to request their manager approval, and then it's going to run that activity. Now the important thing here is, so that's great, that's done. This is now actually going to run it through Orchestrator. This is not running it through my user account. So one of the things I need to do as part of actually this Runbook being able to run at all is, well, what is it running? Orchestrator runs as a particular service. If I go and look at my services.msc, now I'm covering a lot of different things here, and I did kind of warn you about that. If I look at my Orchestrator Runbook service, it runs as my account, my service account, Scorch Serve, which means that account has to have kind of permissions on these remote servers to run these commands. So I kind of made it a local admin. Now, the way I made it a local admin, for me, the easiest way is I used a group policy. I created a group policy object and linked it to my server's container. And I do set local admins. And I just use group policy preferences, not policies. I use preferences. And what I basically say is, hey, I want to add to the local administrators group. I'm not replacing the current content. I'm just adding someone else. I'm adding my Scorch service account. So if I go and edit that group policy object, just so you can see it, it's preferences, not policies. Local users and groups, and I added group. And it's update, the built-in one, add members, my Scorch account. So that means it has permission to do stuff on that. So I'm just using group policy. I could manually do it. I could do it a different way completely. I could, in this PowerShell, actually pass a credential, and I could use variables, for example, with my username and password to use to run those. So there's different ways of achieving this, but that's how I did it. I just made the Scorch account have permission on all those remote servers I want to manage with Orchestrator. So now I have a service request that calls the Runbook after the manager approves it. Once I have that, I really just need to offer it out. So I went to the service catalog and I created a new request offering. And I have my execute PowerShell on machines in AD. And if I edit this, so I gave it a name, you select the icon. So I just created a little PowerShell icon. I give it description. I selected my template, so my run activity service request, the thing I just created. Now my user prompts, I want 2 bits of information. I want the command that they're going to want to be run on all these machines. So I hope you're realizing this is an example. I would not roll this out in any kind of real world. This is extremely dangerous. This is basically running anything they put into every single machine in a group, which could wipe everything out. This is a lab. It's only me using it. This is fine in terms of this testing. I'm just showing this as an example. But more likely in the real world, you're going to have something more specific in here. The goal of this example is to just show you, hey, how I can kind of offer something that does something to a bunch of machines. It's not likely to be a generic any command you type in. I'm doing this so I can demonstrate to different clients, hey, look, I can do anything I want. But most likely you would not have command to run as passed to it. It would be something you define it as a particular action, a set of logic in here. But anyway, I'm going to let them type in that command. And then for the group to target, there's different ways of achieving this. So I have just made it a simple list. So I'm going to tell it the 2 groups I want to make available. But you could also make it, for example, a query result. So it's actually going to go and search, for example, you can make it look for all groups that are in Active Directory and then make them all available. Again, I want this more tailored and controlled. So I'm just doing it as a list. And I configure it. I said, this is just a string. And for my list value, I configured it and I gave it 2 possible groups. So these will show up in the dropdown. And then I map those prompts. So for example, for my Runbook activity, I have to say the Runbook command is the PowerShell command to execute. The target AD group maps to my list value selection. So I'm basically just mapping the prompts I just created to what Runbook property they're expecting. Notice it only shows me 2 because the Runbook ID and the service request ID I'm configuring automatically as part of the service request template. I could link knowledge base article. So I create a little knowledge base article and linked it in here. I have to set it to published and then I'm good to go. So that's now created a request offering. I wanted it to show up kind of pretty. So I created a service offering as well, which is a way to group different things together. So I created a miscellaneous service offering. And basically all I did in here is I gave it a little fire icon. I gave it a category of general. And you just add in the request offerings you want to make available. So my PowerShell request offering and the create an incident, one that's built in offering. Now at this point, as an administrator, it shows up. I would see it here, miscellaneous, I could select it, and sure enough, I'll see my PowerShell option and my instant request. Normal users won't see it yet because they don't have any permissions to it. And this is a way you can kind of control this stuff. So I want to go and create a groups. So I go into groups and I created 2, service offering group and service catalog group. So my service catalog group, so you just do create catalog group. You click next to included members, don't put anything in there. The only thing you're going to fill in is dynamic members. You're going to set the class to request offering. And what I'm going to do is show everything that is published. So basically what I said is if status, so I selected status, clicked add. Here it is, status equals published. Include it. And that's it. I configured nothing else. Then I created another one doing exactly the same thing, create catalog group. And this time included members is blank, dynamic members is service offering. And again, I did status equals published. So now it's all my service offerings and all my request offerings that are published are included in this group. Then I need to give these permissions. Now by default, there are user roles. And there's a built-in user role, end users. And if you look at this, I can't actually change very much. It's all grayed out. It's very restricted to what it can see. For example, it can only see the generic instant request offerings. So I then go and create a new user role, and I created Saviltech end users. And what I did in here is all work items, all configuration items, and for my catalog item, I said only those two I created, which is actually all request offerings that are published and all service requests. Sorry, service offerings that are published. So I checked those two, all templates, and I added this to all domain users. Now, you could be more specific. You might have a whole selection of different request offerings and service offerings that you want different groups to be able to see. So you would create many different groups and add those to the various different roles that have different members of them. For me in my lab, I'm happy to just add kind of every domain user access to all of my request offerings and all of my service offerings. So I created that new user role for all domain users. Now what that lets me do is my standard user, so I'm just logged on as John Saville, I can now see them. Now at this point, I could be done. I could do nothing else. But in the interest of adding one little more complex thing and one more bit of fun, I wanted email notifications. Now I've got another separate video on this channel that talks through setting up the connection to Exchange. But you know what? It's 2014. I wanted to use Office 365. And it was actually really not much to it. So for my connector, I added an Office 365. I just added the Exchange connector. I named it Office 365 connector. And there's really nothing you have to do. Make sure you use the version 1.2.1 version of the Exchange Web Services Managed API, which you download. If you try and use version 2, it will not work. So you have to use version 1.2.1. And I can kind of just show you the link to that really quickly. So if I jump over to my browser and paste that in. So if you just search for Exchange Web Services Managed API, this is the one you want. If it says 2.0, it's wrong. It has to be this version. So for the configuration, leave everything kind of default. Server settings, do not use Auto Discover. This should be the same for every single Office 365 tenant. Do not use your pod number. Use outlook.office365.com/ews/exchange.amsx. That's it. You're going to use a run as account. You're going to say new, and you're just going to type in the name of the Office 365 account you have for your service manager. So you have to create an account in Office 365 for Service Manager. So I created one called Service Manager Work. So you do Service Manager Work at saviltech.biz and the password as a new run as account, and that's it. So if I just did new here, literally it would be Office 365 account, and I literally just do Service Manager Work at, notice it grays out the domain, and then whatever your password is, that's it. Click OK. Now I've already done one, which is this. And that's it. There's nothing special about getting from. This is reading email from Office 365. It fills in the default acknowledged, completed, closed words that it looks for routing incoming. That's it. That is now going to be able to poll that box and get inbound. Outbound is a bit more tricky because if you want to use Office 365, you have an email notification channel, you can't specify a credential. If you look at the edit, my local account won't work in Office 365 unless I've got Federation. So the way around this, what I did, notice I've pointed to myself. I added in the SMTP server role. So for example, if I go and look at Service Manager really quickly, now you'll probably do this on a separate box. Maybe you have an SMTP relay already. But what I did is I just added SMTP server on my local box. And then once you've added the SMTP server, you fire up IIS Manager 6. This is an old school, which is what I've got here. And then you just make it point to Office 365. So the first thing you do, access, I do anonymous and integrated. This is internal to me. I only allow it to work for the IP addresses in my local subnet, i.e. my Service Manager box, and my loopback address, 127.0.0.1. And then for delivery, I say outbound. This is my Office 365 Service Manager account now, and it's password, and I use TLS encryption. I tell it it's using port 587. That's an important change you have to make. And then I just give it the pod that it's using. So that's my actual smart host out in Office 365. So now what's actually happening is the email, as it comes to this local SMTP server, is actually then going to use that credential that I specified to send it to my Office 365 tenant. So now in Service Manager, it basically sends it to itself, which then forwards it via my credential off into Office 365. And I've told it, yep, here's my return email address. This is who it's from. So when I have inbound and outbound email from Service Manager, which now lets me do interesting things. And again, this is set up in other videos. I walk through this. For example, I quickly set up service request when it's completed. So basically I've added a workflow that says, look, when the service request status changed from not completed to completed, it's going to send an email template to the affected user. That email template basically says, hey, this is complete. I have another one around activities that looks for review activity. So what this does is when there's a review activity, i.e. the manager needs to do something, when it changes from not in progress to in progress, it emails the reviewer here. Sorry, and the other one was the requesting user, sorry, not the affected user. Reviewer, hey, you need to approve, and this is the template. And I've already defined those templates. If I've got my template, I have notify reviewer to approve. And this is based around a review activity. And I create some little HTML that says, hey, review this, click this, or you can click approve. Very, very basic. But I actually have hyperlinks in to fill out an email that says approve automatically for them. So what that means is now I'm publishing it in the portal. Remember my service request template has an approval activity first. And then if it's approved, it will then go and run it. So let's see it. Let's put it all together. So I'm a user here. I go to my service portal. And I've got my email open. And I say I want to execute PowerShell. I can see if I have any knowledge base articles. So I have one related to this, and I go to the form. And what I want to do, so I'm going to do something very basic. I'm just going to create a directory. I hope this works. And I'm going to do it to the file services group. So that's these two machines should get a folder that says, I hope this works. I click next and submit. So that's kind of it now. So that's now created this service request. And now in Service Manager, if I go to my work items and I go to my all open service requests, eventually, and in the background while it's doing that, I've got my administrator email box open, because what he should do is get an email saying, hey, because he's the manager in AD, saying, hey, there's a mail for you, a review activity for you to approve. So if I go to my all open service request, I need to scroll this down. That's why it's not working. There we go. So there's a run the Runbook activity. Again, my naming is terrible, but you can see it's in progress. Now the outbound email is not instant. It's going to take a couple of minutes, but I can sort of double click on this and it will show me where it currently is. So currently the activity is it's going to run that. It wants the manager to approve it. And notice the current description is very generic. So this is going to get updated by my Runbook. Okay, so it's sitting there. Fine. I don't have the email. Oh, there we go. That's good timing. So I've got an email. Hey, I can click this link that my email template gave me. And in here, I could select and say approve. And it will go on to the next step. Or because of what my template does, I can just say approve. And it then will go and send an email that puts in the review activity ID in squares and says approved, send. And then within 30 seconds, that will get picked up by Service Manager. So if I go and look at my event log, so I think or every 60 seconds, I think I'm polling. What can I see? Yeah, every minute, so every 60 seconds. So I'll refresh. Oh, there we go. So I done processing emails, updating work. So you saw it found it, processing a mail item. So it updated that work item. So if I go into Service Manager now and look at it again, I should see the approval is done because it received the email via that inbound mail connector, and it should now be running the Runbook. Yep, so that's ticked. Now it's running the Runbook. If I was quick enough, you can actually sometimes see it running. Let's see. Nope, it's not run yet. So if we just sit here, what we'll actually see is this will kick off and run. So it got the approval, and then it sits and waits, and it waits for sort of some timers to click on, and then it's going to call this Runbook. So I'll see the start Runbook. Oh, there we go, started. There we go. And it's going to go through, and it's going to get the service request, get the Runbook activity, run the command, and then complete. And like I say, if you're quick enough, you can kind of capture it actually in motion. And it's done. Log history shows me success. And all of those, so we noticed it ran it, it updated the service request, and it marked it as completed. Great. So we go back to Service Manager. So now it should have disappeared because it's no longer open. My Runbook set it to completed. So it's not open anymore. So it's gone. If I look at my completed, there it is. And notice the description has changed. I injected in running command, I hope this works, on the server when it completed, and then there's the original stuff that was there because I just added this on top of it. And I marked it as completed, which is why it's no longer open. And I could now go ahead and close it because, yep, I'm fine. I could close it as well if I wanted to, but I don't bother with that in the Runbook. If I go to my servers, there's my folder. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on. I walked through a lot of different concepts. I showed you the sort of logging as it was getting the stuff. And if you want the logging, you have to create these two registry keys, enable EWS tracing, set it to 1, and logging level, I set it to 3. And that's under HK Local Machine Software Microsoft System Center Service Manager Exchange Connector. And that gives you that logging that then gets written into the Operations Manager log in the event viewer. But Joe, I mean, it seems like I've covered a lot of stuff, but that included setting up an Office 365 connector, a local relay agent, the Runbook, creating the Runbook automation activity, creating the service request template, all of those things all together. And then, again, I can run anything. Now, do not do this in production. This is running as a local administrator. Any command they type in can really do anything. But my goal was just to kind of show you how powerful this stuff can be. And what I've done, again, if you look in the comments of this, I have sort of all of the templates that I kind of used here. For notifications, my template, that notification. Oh, and the user, actually a good point, go back to the user, go to their email. They now got an email that said, hey, my service request is completed. It was running the command make directory, I hope this was on the servers. And what I did is I sent it the description as part of that template, so we can kind of see what the description was of that. So they now know their request was completed. So sort of from start to finish, they filled it in the GUI. They could still go into this website. They could view their requests, and they would go in and see it was now closed. So there's that one, that latest one just there. I can see all the timing, so the user can go in and see all this stuff. But really, the key point I wanted to show here was about running commands on multiple servers and then making it easily available. The one thing you definitely want to change is that command to run. Don't just make that some random parameter the user can pass. Again, I've made this a local admin so it can really do anything at all. But if you wanted to maybe deploy patches with config manager, so this command being run is passed, it will be a series of actions in PowerShell to hook into config manager and deploy the latest patch package. It might be update malware definitions. It's something you configure. I just did it as maximum flexibility. It may even be you leave the runbook as a command is passed, and then I have different service request templates that actually have that code hard coded. It's not actually passed by the user. I have one service request template for patching, one service request template for malware definition, one service request template for rebooting. And I, in the mapping, hard code in the commands I want to run as part of that. But I hope this was useful. They're all the sort of the key points you have to consider to make these available. Make sure you create those groups, adding sort of knowledge base articles to it. But it's extremely powerful when you put Orchestrator and Service Manager together. And again, I think of PowerShell today. I can wrap PowerShell in some really nice stuff with the activities around Service Manager to get all the activity and the tracking and the ticketing, etc. But given the direction things are going, I would put more and more of my key logic into PowerShell and then use the activities for sort of the surrounding integration with Service Manager. So I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.